ultimate prodigy. Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgang Gottlieb Mozart was the child prodigy by which we measure prodigies to this day. When his 7-year-old sister, Marianne, began harpsichord lessons, the tiny, blonde 3-year-old Wolfgang began to imitate her. It quickly became clear that he was no ordinary 3-year-old. Wolfgang's father, Leopold, began giving him lessons as well, and his progress was astonishing. By 4, little Mozart could learn to play fairly long pieces in a half-hour's time. A few weeks after his 5th birthday, he wrote his first compositions. By 6, he had taught himself to play the violin well enough to participate in the playing of trios and quartets with adults. But Mozart was not just a child prodigy who flashed hot and bright and then settled awkwardly into adolescence and quietly into adulthood. Oh no. He went from being a child prodigy to a preteen prodigy to a teen prodigy to a post-adolescent prodigy to an adult prodigy. His learning curve never stopped. His trajectory never leveled off. He never plateaued. By the time he was 21 in 1777, each of his new compositions was a masterwork. By the time he was 26, 1782, his music had removed itself from the contemporary mainstream and had entered a place of its own making. Mozart's music just kept getting better, and he was in the process of taking his compositional game to an entirely new level when he died in 1791 at the tragically young age of 35 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Mozart's non-stop progress as a composer was not merely a function of his preternatural talent. It was also a function of his superb musical education, for which we have his father to thank, and his own ambition, passion, and hard work. The mature Mozart had mad musical skills. He improvised better than most others could compose. He composed entire symphonies and concerti in his head, and then wrote out the individual instrumental parts without having to first write out the score. The stories regarding the speed with which Mozart composed are legion. What most of us call composing, that is the act of putting notes on paper, Mozart called copying out, meaning that a work was complete in his head, and all that was necessary was that he write it down, copy it out. For example, on the day of its premiere, he had still not copied out any of the sonata for violin and piano, Koelschel 379. In the hour preceding the premiere, he wrote out the violin part, quote, "In order to be able to perform it, I only had time to write out the violin part for Brunetti and retained my own part in my head," unquote. Don Giovanni, 1787. Statement: Wolfgang Mozart was the greatest opera composer who ever lived. Okay, some might choose to argue the point. That's fine. Just know that it is an argument I will win. Mozart's insight into the human condition and relationships, and his ability to illustrate and deepen those insights with music of unparalleled beauty and compositional virtuosity remains, to this day, second to none. Don Giovanni is one of 3 transcendent operas Mozart created with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. The others are The Marriage of Figaro of 1786 and Così fan tutte of 1789. Don Giovanni is about the sins, escapades, and ultimate death of that famed Spanish lecher and rapscallion, Don Juan. For our information, the opera's original title, Il dissoluto punito, ossia il Don Giovanni, translates The Libertine Punished, or Don Giovanni. The overture to to Don Giovanni begins darkly and tragically in the key of D minor and employs the same music that will mark the punishment and death of the Don at the conclusion of the opera. Here's how the overture begins. Following this bleak introductory music, the body of the overture swings into the bright key of D major and features two themes that are meant to represent the Don and his manservant, Leporello. Here is the first of those themes. The expressive bipolarity of the overture, starting in D minor and then going to D major, is a mirror of the bipolarity of the opera itself, a presumably comic opera that ends quite tragically for the Don himself. The overture is itself a 6-minute masterwork, one that Mozart copied out of his head on the night before its premiere. His wife, Constanze, was tasked with waking him up every time he dozed off. According to some sources, Mozart actually had 3 entire overtures to Don Giovanni in his head. According to this story, the singer Luigi Bassi, who premiered the role of the Don, and Mozart's friend, the Prague-based pianist Franz Ducek, together chose the overture in D minor after Mozart played all 3 of them on the piano the day before the premiere. The other 2 overtures were never copied out and were thus lost, along with all the other music Mozart failed to copy out of his head before his death in 1791. Concerto for Clarinet. The same lyric and dramatic skills that made Mozart the greatest opera composer who ever lived also made him the greatest composer of concerti who has ever lived. His output of concerti and concerto-like movements of every sort was prodigious. In all, he composed over 40 concerti, including over 20 for keyboard, 5 for violin, 4 for horn, as well as concerti for flute and harp, for oboe, for bassoon, for clarinet. The list goes on. I will not. Mozart's final concerto for clarinet was completed in mid-October of 1791, roughly 6 weeks before his death on December 5th, 1791. This concerto was inspired by and written for a clarinetist named Anton Stadler. We are told that Stadler was a dissolute fellow. Mozart's sister-in-law, Sophie, went so far as to call him a bloodsucker. Well, whatever his flaws as a man, Anton Stadler, the clarinetist, was a great artist. And it was the rich, round, flexible, human voice-like character of Stadler's playing that inspired Mozart to compose what remains to this day the greatest clarinet concerto in the repertoire. Let's hear the opening of the second movement of the concerto, music that puts the human voice-like sound of the clarinet front and center. Symphony number 41 in C major, Jupiter. In a fit of creative intensity far beyond my ability to fathom, Mozart copied out his last three symphonies, the E flat, the G minor, and the C major, the Jupiter, in 6 weeks total during the summer of 1788, faster than a copyist could have copied out the parts. What can I say about these three miraculous symphonies that hasn't already been said? Nothing. Each one is, in its own way, perfect, and I don't use that word lightly. The Jupiter, copied out between July 26th and August 10th of 1788, is Mozart's longest and most complex symphony, without any question, the greatest and most complex symphonic work written to its time. Complex. Yes, incredible as it may seem. In his own day, Mozart was constantly being criticized for writing unnecessarily complex music. Let's hear just such a passage, the brilliant, ecstatic, awe-inspiring fugue that concludes the fourth and final movement, during which count 'em, 5 separate thematic elements are woven into a tapestry so glorious that we just want to scream. When we hear such music, we know we are in the presence of greatness. And yes, Mozart copied that out of his head in ink, in full score, no sketches, no crossouts, no revisions. That is a prodigy. Thank you.